And I always tell, oops, and I always tell people, just try to start with one thing. If you apply headings to all of your documents, including Word, PowerPoint, PDF, your LMS headings, that's a huge step. I mean, we might see it as, oh, well, that's little. That's a huge step, especially for those students that are navigating mainly with keyboard, or those students that are using screen readers. Because the screen reader will say, hey, this is the title of the document. This is where you start. The next one is a subtitle, and it's chapter 2. This is where you're gonna actually read this document. So all of those little things, they're minimum maybe to like in our eyes, but they make a huge impact on our students.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to, one of our participants asked to be made co-host because they want to share something. So let me do that here real quick.
Well, thanks so much. And it's me. I'm just Brad. I figured might as well share some things along the way. But, I really like what you were saying, Deanna. It just makes so much sense. And I wanted to point out our chat. We have had an awesome conversation going in chat about tools that are out there. And I had mentioned one that's a pay service called Census Access that we use, but it looks like PAVE, P-A-V-E, is free and open source. Thank you, Amy, for that sharing. And it's just so great to have some of those pieces that are out there. So this is just great. I thought I'd share, let's see if I can find my screen here. Oop. All right. Sorry, it wasn't planning to share, but there we go. Hey, can everybody see my screen right now? Does that work okay? Thumbs up, yahoo. I'm a big fan of universal design for learning. And so I just like to really point that out as we think about it. If you haven't ever heard of UDL or Universal Design for Learning, there's an organization called CAST, C-A-S-T.org that is great. And it really works to help us think about the variability of our students. It helps us think about how we're building our content. And one thing that I like to point out, what I wanted to share with you today, is that think of UDL, or what we're doing in this online teaching mode, was really a paradigm shift. We've seen that in other sessions during the conference. We've really been looking at those different things where we really are starting to realize that variability is just the norm. It's just the way that we are going to get our students. And so we can't change always the student because we don't always know their background. But what we can do is think about options with the curriculum. And when I say that, normally I'd get a head turn like you're a dog and what are you saying? But it's really about removing barriers is what it comes to. Are there places in your courses or in the courses you support where students ask a lot of questions, where students say, hey, I don't know where to go next? Or where was that assignment located again? Those could all be easy places to make a little video that's captioned that explains how to navigate the course or how to do an assignment. Sometimes barriers could be not having an exemplar or an example of what students should be creating at the end. And so providing examples for students is a great way to remove barriers from learning. And so when you think about like digital accessibility or universal design for learning, really, it's never changing your goals, your objectives. That's not the purpose of any of this work. It's really about those tight goals, having those objectives set up, and then aligning all your assessments, aligning the projects that you have with those goals. So I always think about flexible means with those tight goals is something that's good. And as Deanna pointed out, and I just wanted to reinforce, it really is what's essential for some is going to be good for all. It really just comes down to that. You're going to have students, like I was a student in college that never told any of my faculty at Indiana University that I had a disability because of the stigma in the 90s. I'm an old guy and there was a huge stigma back then. And so I didn't want to tell anybody about that and just figure it out on my own, where I realize now that some of that is advocation skills, and I think is so important. So, and if you think about what we're trying to do, oh, this is a good training. Thank you so much, Cheryl, for sharing in there. And yes, I love the sharing. This is such a community, so I think it's so important. But when we really think about this, think about how the brain is reacting to the teaching materials that we have. There is so many creative ways. Thank you, Karen, for putting that in. But if we think about the recognition network, the what of learning, the strategic network, the how of learning, the effective network, the why of learning, all those three things need to work together if we're going to be able to meet the learner's needs, if we can meet that variability that's out there. And when I think about some of those things, just to give you a couple quick things that can happen, if you're ever curious about how do I do this multiple means of engagement, or if I hit on the why of learning, think about permitting students choice. Highlighting the relevance of class activities to personal, professional, and academic goals, fostering communities and collaboration, promoting self-assessment and reflection. So, and expensive. There's some great things going into the chat. So I just like to point that out also. But really, it's about providing timely, actionable, ongoing feedback is a big piece to that. And we've seen that in many different ways. This idea that we need to figure out how to provide feedback, not only for the students to give us feedback, but for us to give us students feedback in a comfortable, ongoing way. And so it's really important that we talk about that relevance of course activities, but also the authenticness of those activities and assessments to the learners, what they're getting out of that course. So those are just some quick, takeaways if you're thinking about, well, how could I do this? The what of learning, multiple means of representation, is really about providing content in multiple media formats. Now, I think a lot of you are already kind of in that mode where you're doing those things, where you're thinking about, I'm going to have video, but I'll also have text. I already have a text document. Maybe I'll make a video for it. I have a Word document. Maybe I should make another version of that, but I still think Word is the way to go a lot of the time. Word, students can change Word. Like as somebody that is dyslexic, I could take Word documents and make them work for me. So I'm always a big fan of those Word documents. But it's really providing alternatives for the visual information is an easy way of going if you're thinking about where to get started with some of this. And choosing accessible instructional technologies. I love Padlet. I love some of the other tools out there, but if they don't work for all the students in the class, then we have to come up with some sort of accommodation. But if we have something that works for everybody, then we know it's going to work for everybody. So that's so great. Yeah, I just really wanted to make sure to point that out as some things that are there. And one last one I want to point out while we got a little time is this idea of the how of learning. How are students showing their mastery of content, that they are going to become expert learners that are out there? I think it's all about scaffolding learning support practices and performance, making sure students know what's expected, having rubrics to explain how those things are expected, providing multiple means of communication, which is getting modeled at this awesome ELK conference where we have Discord, we have chat, we can share in so many different ways. It's just a great way. So really, if you think about it, this conference is broadening the idea of how people communicate, how people work together, which is such a great way. And we have little assessments built in. Now, I that was something that took me the longest as an old K-12 teacher, but I really think that this is so great. And I just see Karen's point in here, which is so good. Or I hear, I don't have a student with a disability right now. I can modify my content later if needed. Well, I always like to push back. That's a great one, Karen, by the way. Thank you. And one of the things we like to talk about in that settings is, well, how many students are not telling you about their disability? How many students are you doing? If you proactively start building in accessibility or digital accessibility into your processes, there's such an opportunity later to allow students to learn the way that works best for them. And so I really like that that's an issue. An example being at our school, we have a business school that's super, super well known, but at the same time, you'll meet with faculty and they'll say, we don't have any students with needs. They're all exceptional. You kind of, well, wait a minute, let's think about this a little bit more. And so trying to get people to understand the variability is such a great point. Now, Deanna, what would you like to say? I'll be quiet.
No, I just think it's important to have that open channel that you said about getting feedback from the students, because like you mentioned, in the 90s, you were not telling anybody that you had a disability and you struggle with that alone. I think still happens. I actually think a lot of the students that come from high school, they struggle with having that quote unquote label of, I have a disability. I don't want to be labeled anymore because I had to be pulled out of my classroom every week for I don't know how many hours to have this special accommodation, or when I'm gonna take a test, I had to be pulled out of, in a different classroom and whatnot. A lot of the students come to college to start fresh. They don't want that label. They just want to do it on their own. And for us implementing these little things, it will make a huge difference and huge impact for them, for their learning success. So I think just having that open conversation without really actually having to point out that somebody has a disability, I was like, maybe it's like, hey, what type of, Poppy, I'm sorry. Hey, what type of learner are you? Are you a visual, an auditory, a kinesthetic? How do you learn better? So to something that is like a survey at the beginning of your course to learn more about your students, to maybe implement little things here and there. And I'm a fan of doing a mid-semester survey to see how things are working out, because I'm not perfect. I'm gonna be screwing things up. I'm gonna miss something that I didn't actually even realize that I was missing. Having the student feedback and for them telling me, hey, this would be actually beneficial for us, maybe this type of assignment, that would be great, because that will actually cover that UDL part, that accessibility part as well. Another thing that Karen mentioned, that, oh, I don't have a student with a disability. We encounter that on a daily basis. That's why I actually do not even mention we have to do this, because it's part of the QM review or it's part of the score review. Like I don't actually mention it. I just tell them, I just kind of like include it in their development process, like kind of making it part of the process of the fund, not making it like something separate. Like, okay, now that I have my presentation, let's add alt text, let's make all of these headings. No, like I actually, in the process of doing it, I actually implement that in the way they don't see it as an extra task. I don't know if that makes sense.
Oh,
So if I may just jump in real quick, I just want to be cognizant of time here. So we have, let me do a little quick check here. We've got about a little over 15 minutes left. So wanted to see if there's anyone else in our audience that might have a question or comment, or could give us kind of an idea of what they're doing at their particular institute. Anyone else want to jump in? You can unmute and go for it. Put something in chat, whichever you prefer.
And we did have a couple good things in chat that I just wanted to point out. Thank you, Vicky, for giving us an example of case our NC State, which is just amazing that's out there. And Dr. Linda, thank you so much for bringing that up. I appreciate it. And Danielle had a great question, I think, Greg, that could be good to kind of address. Like, how can we have those conversations with instructors who are looking to use innovative and engaging tools, but due to accessibility, they cannot use it? They find it hard to balance and achieve. And I want all students to be able to participate and feel included. As a result, I think we sometimes limit possibilities in tool exploration. I think that's kind of an interesting conversation piece that Danielle brings up, kind of following up, Greg, to what you were saying.
Well, Danielle is one of my colleagues, so she always comes up with great questions.
I try. I think I've had that instructors, they bring this really great tool and I love it. I'm like, oh, I see all these possibilities we can have. But then I instantly think to those students who they need the screen readers or, and unfortunately, as I've seen in the chat, a lot of these developers of these products, they're slow to the game. And other than pushing them to say, hey, we need this, like I'm doing something with Storyline right now. And there's something that one of my instructors really wants to use, but it's still not, after all these years, it is still not accessible. And so it's how do we balance? Thankfully, this instructor is very mindful of all of those requirements. So we are going to back off on that. But it's how do we kind of explore and we keep being innovative, but yet we're being very mindful of all of these things. I think that's just probably the biggest challenge I run into.
Oh, I really appreciate that. And if I could answer to that, working at CU Boulder, I've run into that over the last 10 years quite a few times, probably daily, weekly, Deanna knows. And so one of the things that I try to start with is I'll use prototype or persona students. And we've built some around media, who uses different types of media. But the idea is I will run a scenario with the faculty member about how a student would use that new innovative technology. And that normally brings out oh, I hadn't thought of that yet. And then you start talking about the percentage of students that probably would navigate the course in that particular model. And so we do use a lot of, or at least I have in the past, of archetypes, personas, learning personas. There's been so many different names for that over the time. And Vicky said there is one in an earlier session. I couldn't figure out how to use it, but there are some out there. There was one that was like a UX card where you could take your situation through a certain UX situation. And so that's always been kind of interesting too. And so, you know, Danielle, it's such a question that is always evolving of how do we have these conversations? And my first thought is slowly, you know, you're kind of introducing somebody to get their awareness, and then you're trying to build their desire to do things a little bit differently. And normally, if we focus on the proactivity, can reduce some of the effort that they have to put in later, that if they make certain choices early that will really work for all students, that's an efficiency tool in their world when they're focused in on research, or they have family, or they're taking care of their parents, or whatever it might be. It's just a way of kind of helping people get started in that space. So yeah, I really, really appreciate it. And I love all the conversations going in on chat. We have such a great audience right now. I'll stop sharing, but I wanted to share one last thing with you, and then I'll stop my share. But I love Cheryl. I think she's just amazing. I keep reading all of her books, and I basically try to follow her around. But this is her website. If Cheryl was here today, she would definitely be pointing out her Do It site, and the link is in chat if you ever need it. And I just wanted to point out, they just have so many great resources available. And so even line drawings, collections, you know, they have so much in there if you ever need to use any of this or understand the why behind you're doing this. And I've used this, Danielle, with faculty members. Like, let's talk about some of these situations, these personas. What happens in certain situations? And so they have some great resources I just wanted to point out. I know Cheryl, normally when she presents, she will definitely, you know, hit on some of these and show some of those pieces that are out there. But I find them so useful. And the invisible disability was the one that really caught my attention probably 5 years ago. So I just wanted to put that in there. I like it. Any questions coming up? And I'm sorry, Greg, we'll go back to what you were saying. I'll stop my share.
Well, I was just going to respond. I believe it was Amy that posted and asked if there's an example of a tool. And so and I think there were a couple replies. Something I encountered recently was a course that wanted to use OER. They didn't want to have students pay $200, $300 for a textbook, which in a lot of times they never used anyway, right? So he found this excellent site at Oregon State, excellent content, current, and he sent me the link for it. And one of the first things I did was I sent an email message and said, hey, is your content accessible? And I think their response, I wish I could quote it directly, but it was, yeah, we haven't looked into that yet. So I would caution, as we were kind of moving into this OER world, right? Removing kind of the traditional textbooks, but Amy, that might be an example where there are some accessibility concerns. You know, you have the main content with respect to reading in a class that is not accessible, right? And what do you do with that? Because the source of that is not going to spend time, at least now, to make it accessible, right? So I hope that helps, Amy, as an example. Another thing I'd like to just mention, Diane brought it up, we also use Quality Matters, and what is that? I should memorize this by now. Section Standard 8, I think, is the kind of the accessibility portion of the rubric. And,
yes, guideline 8.
Yeah, so what we noticed as we've been using QM is when we, as a reviewer, when we would get to that section, we're like, oh gosh, you know, basically I'm gonna have to go through every single page of the course, you know, everything. So what a couple of our teammates did was put together an accessibility checklist as a precursor to running the rubric. So basically, before we start QM, we run this accessibility checklist, and that basically prepares the reviewer for knowing that the course, for all intents and purposes, not 100% Diana, but pretty darn close, that it's accessible. And so when they get to that standard in QM, they don't have to spend that additional time because it's already been done. So that's another option, is to create these additional tools, particularly if you're using QM. So we got about 10 minutes left. I want to respect everybody's time. First of all, let me just say, we've been dancing pretty darn good during this 50 minutes, I think. So thank you for everybody participating. Cheryl, I think your hand's up.
Yeah, actually, I just wanted to say, and somebody, I think maybe you started to segue into one of my points was that we need to start holding our vendors accountable. And so whoever brought up the VPAT, that's a very important piece in purchasing your software at your colleges. As you're researching new technologies, make sure that there is a VPAT and that they stand behind the accessibility, and that should be something that's on your checklist. We had a couple of vendors that were really pushing some of our faculty at Ames Community College to purchase, and I said, well, are you accessible? And his response was, well, we're in Australia and we have different standards, so we don't have to meet the United States standards. And I said, and I am in the United States and I don't have to purchase your product. And that was the end of the conversation. So, you know, it's a two-way street out there, and people, when it comes down to it, I work really closely with our disability access services team as an instructional designer. And when it comes down to it, the school is who's responsible to make the content accessible for the students when an issue occurs. The law is going to come after the college, and potentially the way the laws are starting to change, even potentially the instructors and the administrators of those departments and programs, not the vendor. So they are not held to the same standards as institutions or organizations, educational organizations. So just be cautious about, you know, and going to the conversation about how do you hold that conversation with somebody is just, you know what, this is not just be honest with them. This is not an accessible tool. Just realize that going in, you want to already start thinking about an alternative format that is equal to something that you're teaching your the rest of the class with. So because it has to be an equal tool. So those are my points. We're working really hard at Ames to do it. We've adopted Ally as it's Blackboard Ally. We use D2L though. And they are coming up with some, it's a really interesting tool. It is expensive, but we use CARE dollars to purchase it. So note that if it is accessibility related, your CARE dollars, if you still have some funding, I don't know what the expiration date was on that, but you can use that money for that as well. So think about those things, and good luck. And thanks for having such a broad-minded group here. It's really exciting that there's so many people here. Thank you.
Oh, that's awesome, Cheryl. And I cannot stand enough behind the vendors. I used to do a lot of vendor relations, and oh, it is so difficult to push the vendors, but we have to. And, you know, when you say you're going to drop the vendor, they normally make some changes pretty quick, you know, or they release some different things, or they start thinking about hiring, you know, accessibility specialists that they had not had before. Like Cengage is a company that does that, just started getting into accessibility. So it's so important to push back, Cheryl. I really appreciate that.
So we have about 5 minutes. Any final examples, comments, any additional input anyone would like to make?
I can always talk, as anybody who's ever met me knows. I'm just a talker, but I wanted to hit on.
Hey, wait a minute. Brad and Diana, I'm just gonna suggest that maybe next year around this time, you guys submit a proposal for the conference, because I think the two of you would do a great job. So back to you, Brad.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And Karen brought up a good question about, do I need to change my goals to make it so I'm doing accommodations correctly? And I want to get you away from that. Always think about tight goals. You have an objective. The objective will stay the same, but if you make a rubric of how to meet that objective, then you create options. Maybe a student meets the objective doing a skit, or we saw in earlier presentations at the conference doing more artistic work. I'm a big fan of reflection, having students reflect on what they learned and what it means to them as a way to show mastery, especially when I was an old K-12 special ed teacher. But I think it's really important to think about those really tight goals. Your objectives don't change. It's just the way that the students are going to show mastery might be different. And by having those tight goals and developing kind of a rubric, and then maybe that's the stretch goal for you, the rubric part, but by developing that rubric, then you can create all sorts of options for students to show mastery of that content, whatever it might be. And I'm thinking about accessibility. When we, the pushback from faculty, I used to build a lot of aerospace courses, and they were like, we're only going to talk in math terms. Well, that doesn't work for everybody. How can we change this a little bit? So it was one of those really important pieces that are there. Yep. But I just really appreciate your time. I know we're getting close to the end now, Greg. Oh, Deanna, way to come home at the end. I love it. If anybody needs to make a quick copy paste of those great 8 things, that's awesome, Deanna.
Well, I think we're gonna shut her down. Again, I appreciate everybody attending this session. It wasn't kind of maybe what you expected, but maybe it wasn't too bad either, right? So we do have an evaluation form. Feel free to fill that out, even though it wasn't for the particular presenter, but thanks for jumping in, staying with us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of our conference today, and we'll finalize things in our final day tomorrow. So thank you, everyone. Enjoy the day.
Thank you all for participating. It's so fun to get people's perspectives on things. And Greg, way to pull it off. All right. I like that. Way to go, Greg.
I don't have to go dancing with my wife now. I've
Yes.
I've extended all my dancing skills in 50 minutes. So thank you, Brad and Diana. Really appreciate you jumping
Brad,
in there.
I'm sorry I put you on the spot. I actually, I just told Donna was like, Brad and I are doing it without even asking Brad before.
Hey, totally game. You know me, I can always talk. Whatever you need me to do, set me in there and I'll take it over.
Sorry I put you on the spot.
No, definitely glad. I love this stuff. Now I'll get out of here so you can retake the Zoom account and do your next thing. Thanks again, Greg.
Well, before you go, I don't know if you are both planning. We're still trying to figure out where Colt is going to be, virtual, hybrid, live. But if you come to Colt and it happens to be live, look me up and Starbucks on me, or beer on me, or whatever the heck you want. So
hey, I want to go up to Stumpy's little cidery up in Fort Collins.
Have a good day.
Have a good one.
Have a good one. But yeah, count us in. Colt is one. We'll always do presentations at Colt. I was in OIT for a long time and have always presented at Colt. So count me in. We'll do some stuff on UDL and digital accessibility at Colt. That'll be the plan. We'll do it, because it's part of the track, and I'm trying to group everybody from a bunch of campuses together to start talking about that. So we're trying to build a community around UDL.
Fantastic. All right. Enjoy the rest of the conference.